Hi class, this is Dr. Burke, and this is a brief lecture on the research on women's victimization and offending. So in this chapter we discuss the UCR, the NCVS, the NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and other areas of data gathering. We'll also talk about feminist methodology and why it's so important when we're discussing women and offending and victimization. So then we can launch into the theories and really tie some of this stuff together. There are different data sources on women as victims and offenders, and depending on where we get our data, it'll tell us a drastically different picture of what women experience as victims or the type of crimes that they commit as offenders. The differences between the sources of crime data, such as the purpose of the data collection, is it for victimization research or is it for the UCR for police arrest statistics? The type of data that's collected, is it arrest data or is it a personal survey that somebody's filling out? What is the population sample? So what is the specifics of the data collection, the region, the time frame, what's going on historically that might change the data that we're collecting, and the management of the data sets. Who is in charge of storing this data or collecting it? The Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR, is the best known and largest data set on crime that we have. It has data from over 17,000 police agencies across the United States, and it's published annually by the FBI. It's completely voluntary for police departments to collect their data, and then they send it to the FBI, who then compiles it and runs all the numbers. It's viewed as the most accurate assessment of the crime rate, so it's as complete as we have. And it allows for comparisons over time because it's been collected since the early 70s. The UCR arrest trends comparing 2010 to 2001 data. So in this 10-year span, we see a big increase in female arrests resulted as a significant effect on the female crime rate. So when you're looking at the crime rate for females specifically, it's important to notice the population size. Prevalence versus incidence. What is the percentage of female offending versus what is the raw number of female offenders? So it's going to look like there's this drastically huge uptick or this drastically huge downtick of female offenders or committing certain crimes because there's so few of them to begin with. The UCR measures victimization. It has a supplemental homicide report known as the intimate partner homicide. This has issues in determining relationships between offenders and victims, which is interesting because it tells us how they're related. Are they husbands? Are they wives? What is their nature of their partnership? Many cases where the detail is not reported, so we don't have a full scope of understanding. And unfortunately, this supplemental reporting only reports the current relationship status, not if they were previously married or if they were previously boyfriend and girlfriend. While the UCR is as good as we can get for data, there are several disadvantages to using it as the sole means of trying to figure out what the crime rate is. It only includes crimes reported to the police, so there's what's known as the dark figure of crime, which are the number of crimes that go unreported because people don't feel like they want to involve the police, that the police will help in any way, or they just figure, it's not that big of a deal. Why would I need to report a burglary of my Bell Biv DeVoe CD and my Discman? Nobody's ever going to get that back. Why would I need to tell the police about it? So it only includes crimes that are reported to the police, not ones that still happen and the police never find out about. It also only includes data on certain types of crime. These are the Part 1 index offenses, and there are 8 of them. Murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, theft or larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. That's it. Only those 8. So things like drug offenses, which accounts for most of the females incarcerated. Drug offenses are not involved. Kidnapping's not involved. Embezzle. There's a lot of other crimes that have no bearing on the UCR. Those crimes are called Part 2 index offenses, and they're not captured on the UCR. There's also the problem of the hierarchy rule. So with the UCR, if an individual commits 3 of those 8, so let's say Skippy decides to steal a car, then he goes and burglarizes his neighbor's house, and then he drives around the block and kills old Mrs. Wilson. Well, those are 3 index offenses, but only the worst of those is going to be reported. So even though he committed 3, only that murder, because that's the worst on the index scale, that's the only one that's going to be reported. Additional disadvantages to using the UCR include incomplete reporting. So there's what's known as the hierarchy rule, where only the most serious crime is reported. So out of those 8 index offenses that were mentioned previously, if Sally decides to steal a car and then go burglarize her neighbor's house and then drives around and kills old Mrs. Wilson, well, 3 of those things that Sally just did are index offenses, but only the worst one, which is the murder, will be reported to the UCR. So even though 3 crimes happened, only 1 of those crimes is going to make it. So it doesn't give us a complete idea of how much crime is happening. There's time limitations to the reporting. There's participation by police agencies. Because it's voluntary, not all police officers or police departments partake in sending their data to the FBI. Crime definitions, what's defined by one police department might not be defined as the same crime to another. So it's reporting practices can be very different. And some people say that the UCR might actually do more harm than good because of these limitations. Because the UCR has so many issues, we had the introduction of NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, in 1988, which provides a more comprehensive understanding of crime events. So this includes completed and attempted crimes. There's no hierarchy rule, so everything goes on here. And it includes more extensive data. Was there a presence of a weapon? Who was the victim? Who was the offender? What was the race? What was the gender or sex? What's the ethnicity? Like everything, the age. There's so much more complete data involved in NIBRS, but it's really expensive. And so only about 32 police departments have utilized this because there need to be on hand all the time crime data analysts collecting all of this and then sending it to the FBI. And so a lot of states haven't even begun to participate in this. While we certainly like NIBRS, there's also disadvantages. Not all the police departments are participating. And like the UCR, NIBRS only includes crimes reported to the police. There's really no way for these official arrest statistics to get away from the dark figure of crime. In order to make up that gap of the data, we also utilize the National Crime Victimization Survey, or the NCVS. This is the largest victimization study in the United States. It fills in the gap left by the dark figure of crime. However, it's self-report data. So what happens with this, it's a panel study, and households across the United States are surveyed for 3 years, but only victims or household members aged 12 or older in the house are able to report victimization. And usually they ask, in the last 6 months, what has happened? And so you go through the survey and tick everything off in the last 6 months. And it follows these set households for 3 years. If you look at the difference between the UCR and the NCVS, and I posted both of the most current UCR's data and the NCVS, so if you look in the Moodle site, you'll see those documents. And you'll see there's this drastic difference between the amount of reported crime and the amount of self-reported crime. So the REST data versus the self-report data. NCVS usually has about twice as much crime as the UCR. And so it kind of makes you sit back and say, well, how is that possible that there'd be twice as much victimization than arrests? And how is that happening? So the NCVS has tried to change the way that they designed their survey in order to increase accuracy, so there's not that huge discrepancy in the data. It added questions about offenders known to the victims. It added questions regarding the variety of incidences. There's additional training and queuing options for interviewers, so when they sit down with the families at the very beginning, they go through more extensive detail of what they're looking for the NCVS. And it uses general behavior characterizations. The NCVS in 2010 reported that women and girls experienced over 500,000 incidences of non-fatal violent victimization. This indicates a higher crime rate than the official data, and you can see the comparison between those. What we find when we look at the UCR and the NCVS is that violent offending among men and women has remained generally stable over the years. What has changed has been the increase of women offending in the traditionally male categories. So things that females always were doing, like resisting arrest or harassment or disorderly conduct, are now getting upticked into different categories such as simple assault. And so it looks like there's a surge of women offending in assaultive violent behavior. However, they were always doing that. It was just called something different. And that's what's known as net widening. There's also evidence that shows that the gender gap is narrowing. While we certainly like the UCR and the NCVS for giving us a general idea of how much crime and victimization is happening, it doesn't capture everything, especially intimate partner and sexual violence. Since it's a family reporting for the NCVS, since it's a household reporting, we don't get at domestic violence, we don't get at child abuse, because those things aren't reported as a family unit or as a household. And so in order to try to capture more of that victimization, there are additional sources of data, such as the National Violence Against Women Survey, which first appeared in 1995 and 1996. It was the first comprehensive data assessment of violence against women by acts of intimate partner abuse, stalking, and sexual assault. Another example is the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is conducted by the Centers of Disease Control and National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. In 2010, this data set included interviews from over 16,000 people, and their findings report the victimizations in a variety of crimes, including sexual assault, intimate partner violence and abuse, and stalking. These findings are then used to create estimates about the extent of crime throughout the entire United States. The results from this survey are truly poignant. The results indicate that 1 in 5 white women and black women and 1 in 7 Latina women in the United States has been raped at some point in their lifetimes. While this rate of victimization is terrible, it's even worse for American Indian and Alaskan Native population, where 1 in 4, or almost 27% of the women, experience rape within their lifetime. Unfortunately, we don't have a good idea from this data about race and ethnicity in male victims, but it's hypothesized that about 1 in 50 men are raped at some time in their life. Your chapter finishes up with talking about The Contributions of Feminist Methodology to Research on Women and Crime, and basically discusses the aspect of traditional criminology and how it fails to recognize gender differences when looking at research and collecting data. Feminist researchers have placed women's issues at the center of the research process, which gives women an active voice in discussing or exploring or explaining their crime, their offending, their victimization. And so through this, most of the methodology in the feminist realm is considered to be qualitative, so that's sitting down, doing interviews, really extrapolating the meat of the issue. So really getting the histories and the stories and the context behind offending and victimization. And so it accounts for more emotions and values. It gives more depth and breadth to the issue. But that's not to discount quantitative, because quantitative is very, very important. However, with the female population of offenders, they're known as the tyranny of small numbers. It's difficult to get a data set that's big enough that you're going to have statistical significance. But there is still definitely a place for quantitative research methods within feminist methodology. Because most of the feminist methodology is qualitative, and that's what it's associated with, it's the process by which data is gathered, and there is a relationship between the researcher and the research subject, or as we call them, participants, because it is an interview, it is more fluid. There are 5 basic principles for feminist methodology. The first, acknowledge the influence of gender in society. Number 2, challenge the traditional research methodology. 3, increase awareness of gender in methodological processes. 4, empower women in patriarchal society through their participation in research. And 5, the researcher awareness of ethical costs of research and needs to protect the subjects or the participants. With quantitative research, it's very distant and I say cold, because you're just looking at raw numbers and you're manipulating data. However, with the feminist methodology, there's a huge contrast. It's not distant. There's a relationship between the researcher and the participant, and a life story is emerging, and that is what we're discussing, is this pathway to offending. What type of victimization occurred in someone's life that would then turn them into an offender, rather than saying 5 out of 6 individuals participated in this. Well, why? What are the causes? What type of history did they experience? Feminist methodology really does seek connectivity and looks at the continuum of care for research participants. It's not just discovering the answer or proving the null hypothesis, but looking at policies and ways to change. It's beneficial compared to traditional methods because there's the ability to explore women's issues more in depth within the context of their lives, and allows for multiple truths based on gender experiences, ethnic experiences, and really being able to delve deeper into the issues. It does not exclude quantitative measures, which are extremely valuable as well, but the tools that are applicable across the criminological topics can be used in quantitative research as well, because with the qualitative interviews, you're collecting information on race and class, socioeconomic status, family, offending history, number of priors. You're still getting quantitative information from qualitative research. And so, in summary, this chapter discussed how we gather data and the official measures of crime, the official measures of victimization, other strategies for collecting data, and then finally, how we can apply this feminist lens or mindset to the collection of data so that we can then delve into theories to try to attempt to explain and predict female offending and victimization. And that is the lecture for part 2 or chapter 2, which is all about the research methods of female offending.